Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to feature our exclusive panel, Bias and Racism in Gaming, the first in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Gaming series. Please be sure to follow this series, through hashtag the role players 4 with the number 4, DEI. And so by now, many of us have seen the news coverage of the civil unrest sparked by the deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery at the hands of police violence. In response, many businesses and communities released solidarity statements condemning systemic racism. We even saw Wizards of the Coast announcing changes to D&D in response to the protests. Their statement specifically read, quote, "Legacy D&D content does not reflect who we are today. Throughout the 50-year history of D&D, some of the peoples in the game, orcs and drow being two of the prime examples, have been characterized as monstrous and evil, using descriptions that are painfully reminiscent of how real-world ethnic groups have been and continue to be denigrated. That's not right, and that's not something we, as in Wizards of the Coast, believe in. Despite their conscious efforts to the contrary, they've allowed some of those old descriptions to reappear in the game. They recognize that in order to live their values, they have to do an even better job in handling these issues. And if they make mistakes, they have said that their priority is to make things right. So even as we, as the role players, aired our own solidarity statement live at the beginning of June, in lieu of our regular programming, we continue to ask ourselves, what more can we do to help dismantle systemic racism? How can we put actions behind our mission of creating a more welcoming gaming community? And how can we step up for our Black and Brown siblings who are suffering from racism so deep that many don't even see it embedded in our systems and our everyday life? And it's those very questions that bring us here today to this panel. And as a thank you for joining us in these critical conversations, we will be giving away a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And we're also giving away a copy of 3 separate one-shot adventures, one in Pathfinder, one in Keyforge, and one in Starfinder, donated by one of our very own panelists. Then in the last few minutes of the panel, we'll have you enter the keyword community in the chat box for a chance to win, but please wait till the end of the panel. Also for today, any subs, any cheers, any bits, and all the other ways that you show your digital love tonight will be donated to Colors of Change. At the end of the panel, we will have about 10 minutes for an open Q&A. Check out the chat box for a link where you'll be able to submit your questions so that we can then ask it here live to our panel. But please remember to be respectful as we are all on this journey of learning and unlearning together. All right, so panelists, are we ready to begin? We're going to start with introductions. And as I read the introductions of the bios for our panelists, they will wave, tip their hat, or do a little jig to let us know that that's them. So first up, we have TreaAndrea M. Russworm, an associate professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a series editor of Power Play, Games, Politics, Culture from Duke University Press. She's the author of Blackness is Burning, Civil Rights, Popular Culture, and the Problem of Recognition, published by Wayne State University Press, and co-editor of Gaming Representation, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in Video Games by Indiana University Press. And then lastly, also Media to Media Mogul, Theorizing Tyler Perry, published by University of Mississippi Press. Additionally, her work has been published in The Velvet Light Trap, Frontiers, and Black Camera. She is currently writing a 4th book on race, video games, and the politics of play. All right, up next, we have Cicero Holmes, a lifelong gamer. He turned his passion for video games into the Spawn on Me podcast. It is the preeminent podcast that he co-created and spotlights people of color in the gaming industry. He then discovered his joy of tabletop RPGs when he was invited to participate in an actual play game created by Wizards of the Coast, Rivals of Waterdeep. The show, the show is unique as it features an all POC cast. He originated the character Perrin Underbow, who is currently on a fellowship at an HBCU, historically barred college or university, while the rest of the cast furthers their adventures. I love that, Cicero. All right, next we have my numbers here are off. All right. Jessica Rojas has been an anti-racist community organizer since 2009. She began her anti-racism work through her work as an AmeriCorps Martin Luther King Jr. Vista volunteer in service to America, in which she worked to integrate racial and social equity principles into her work with young people. Jessica has been involved in grassroots organizing with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond and the Chicago Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. She is known for building solidarity, allies across organizations, connecting the roots of struggle movements, including Black Lives Matter, Palestinian liberation, and immigrant rights. Jessica works for the National Office of the YMCA based in Chicago, and as a senior manager of networks and engagement, and leads the integration of anti-racism work and equity principles into nonprofit operations for a federated organization of over 10,000 communities. We now also have Victor Rivera, AKA Quasar as his gamer name, also works at the Y. He's an aspiring author, a partner and a father, a part-time gamer, and sometimes a DM who loves hunting for collectibles. If he were to describe himself, he'd say, if the planet is moving at 1,000 miles an hour, I'm trying to go 1,001. Vic remembers a time when he would secretly watch anime or BSG, which I admittedly, maybe I shouldn't admit this, had to ask and clarify what that is. Battlestar Galactica, for those who might not know.
Wow.
And did I just kill myself there? So as he was watching anime and BSG, he spent nights playing Blitzball to unlock Waka's celestial weapon. Now he wanders the world with headphones on and avoiding spoilers while listening to high fantasy novels because everyone loves dragons and comic books now. He hates the word potential, and he will never try to prove you wrong, but would love for you to consider him being right from time to time. We also have now Jenna Struble, who identifies as a queer woman living her life as a creative humanitarian. After 10 years in the entertainment industry, literally running away from the circus, she followed her passion to serve communities. She began a nonprofit career as a victim advocate and educator, moving towards youth empowerment and leadership work in 2005. More recently, she served as an association team director for the YMCA Metropolitan Dallas, where she also served on the diversity and inclusion team as an equity advocate and training facilitator. Even in this role, Jenna understood that as a product of a racist educational system and culture, she is still capable of racist tendencies and works to be a better anti-racist. She currently consults with nonprofits and leaders on how to better serve their staff and clients equitably and empathetically. And for our panel, last but certainly not least, we have DM Jud Grubbs, who is the DM of our very own role player show. He started his D&D journey 2.5 years ago when a close friend ran a game for him. He was instantly hooked. I mean, most of us were, right? Same story for me here.
Definitely.
And it didn't take long before his house was full of minis and dice and terrain and D&D books. And if you've ever seen our shows, you know that is legit truth right there. Jud decided to take this passion to the masses with the role players. He is a screenwriter by trade, selling his first product, an animated film, to Sony Pictures. His most recent script, a psychological thriller, pulling from his D&D experiences. And in addition, Jud is the CEO of an insurance brokerage firm and head of a national sales for a health tech startup. When Jud is not creating, he can usually be found lifting weights, training jujitsu, and enjoying time with his family. And then I am Jamie Umanzor, aka Jamie Moonchild in chat and on Twitter, and I am your host for today. I am a queer woman of color and daughter of immigrants. I lived in LA, Hawaii, and Chicago, and just recently moved back to LA. I love D&D, have a very serious dice problem. My friends have told me I might be able to give some people a run for their money in how much dice they have. I also run a pre-colonial Hawaii-inspired campaign. I am the community manager for the role players, and I have the honor of being the YMCA of the USA's first national manager dedicated to LGBTQ plus inclusion and equity. Currently, I'm the founder and principal consultant of C3 Equity Consulting, working nationally to create cultures of change and equity by providing LGBTQ plus and organizational diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting with a focus on culturally humble and trauma-informed business, community, and human resources strategies. All right, that was a lot of mouthfuls. So let's kick off with why we're here. And if we can now, please share your names so that we can remind folks who we are and your pronouns and the reason why we're participating in this panel. And so I'll start us off as an example. Again, my name is Jamie and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm here because I never thought that my two greatest passions, which is D&D and DEI work, could ever actually really come together in this way. And there's so much change and good that needs to happen. And if we don't take these chances to have these conversations, it won't happen. So that's why I'm here today. We will kick it back to now Trey, for why you're here.
I'm here because I was invited. But I'm also genuinely interested in these topics, living as a Black person, as a Black academic who also teaches and plays games. This just seems like a natural kind of fusion of interests that relate to me, so I'm here because I'm in good company.
All right, thank you, Trey. And your pronouns, please. I apologize for not reminding.
My pronouns are she, her.
Thank you so much. And next we'll go to Cicero.
Hey, I'm Cicero. Pronouns are he, him. And why I'm here is, well, first I was invited, but also because, I've got skin in the game, both literally and figuratively. Listen, we all need to work together in order to make the world a better place. Whether that is wearing a mask, controversial, I know, trying to save the climate, controversial, I know, or trying to get a better understanding of everyone's cultures and having not a tolerance but an acceptance of everyone's cultures, and that is part of the reason that we're here today is in order for us to gain that level of acceptance, we first must acknowledge where we've been deficient, and I think that is one of the things that we're going to try and tackle tonight.
Thank you, Cicero. Next up, we have Jess.
Hi, I'm Jessica. My pronouns are she, her. I would say I'm here because I got invited. Thanks. I'm excited. But I would also say that I think it's important, regardless of what community, circle, friends, family, space that you're in, having these hard conversations around race and racism and how it's impacting your community and the spaces that you're living in is highly important. And so I always want to ensure that we help to cultivate these conversations, even when they feel uncomfortable, because oftentimes the people that you can actually learn from are the ones that you're closest to. And so from my experience, the gaming community is one that is very close. And so I feel honored to be invited in to help cultivate that space.
Thank you. And next, Jenna.
Well, Jenna Struble, I go by she, her, hers, and I'm just so grateful to be part of this community. I'm not in the gaming community, but I'm gaming adjacent. I have a lot of friends and people in family, my spouse that loves gaming, and it's really an amazing community of people. And I think this panel and these discussions, it's just an honor to be here to make the gaming community a better place, a more welcoming place, where everyone can belong and be themselves. And, even when we're playing a role, it's nice to just be able to be who you are. And as a person who, has a lot of learning and a lot of different background in my own life, I just embrace that and want to help other people embrace that learning and that unlearning. and just help any way that I can. So thank you for having me be here.
Thank you, Jenna. Vic.
Hey everyone, Victor Rivera, he, him. A few months ago, Jamie shot me this idea and I was like, yeah, sure, when it happens, I'll be there. And tonight it's happening. So I'm glad to be part of this. Yeah, throughout the years, I played a lot of games, whether they were board games, D&D, some Pathfinder, some Starfinder, and I was the only one at the table. So being Afro-Latino was real tough, seeing weird things happen and not being able to have the conversation because I didn't want my miniature thrown across the room and have to get kicked out of someone's house. So I kind of, shut up and played up. But now we get to, have the conversation and let the community know that it's something we can talk about. And if you're going to be at someone's house for hours on end, kicking back beers and playing a game, why not talk about life?
Thank you. Jud.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jud Grubbs, he, him. I have a long history with gaming, as Jamie said. I've been in the D&D world for a couple of years now. As a kid, I really wanted to be in D&D, but I didn't know anybody who played, so I would just buy the modules and long to be a part of it. But the reason that I'm here tonight and the reason why we're even doing this is that when everything started kind of bubbling up again and there was a lot of attention on Black Lives Matter and these issues, we immediately did a fundraiser and I thought, I want to do a lot more than just posting on Instagram or giving a few dollars to an organization. And we said, well, let's start with our own community. Let's look at the gaming community. Let's see the biases that are out there. Let's look at the racism that we may not even notice is there. And so I'm here as a way to kind of unlearn things that I might have learned incorrectly and to learn what we can all do as a species moving forward to make the world a better place. So I want to thank everybody here for joining us tonight. I'm super excited to have you all here.
Thank you so much, Jud. And all right, so now we're going to dive right into our questions for the panel. And this is open to the entire panel. In light of the civil unrest, as I mentioned earlier, sparked by the deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless other Black lives that have been lost to systemic racism, how do these conversations relate to gamers and the gaming community? Who would like to go first?
You pick somebody.
Okay, we'll go with you, Cicero.
Oh man, jeez! I already said what I had to say. Yeah. So, I think from my perspective, when you're in this skin, you feel it, and it didn't take just this trio of tragedies to happen in order for me or other Black and brown folks, other stop and frisk victims to understand the pain that it causes. We live with that constantly, and it, it just becomes a little bit more apparent. But gaming is an escape. Gaming is a hobby. It's a thing that people do for fun, and we're no different. The problem is, where it comes in is that we're trying to escape the horrors of reality. And whether you're playing at a table full of non-POCs or whether you're playing a game online like Call of Duty, you may find that there isn't that respite from, you can't have that catharsis of just doing whatever it is that you want to do, digitally punching a wall, because people are still making you angry. And so you don't find an escape, because it just feels like there's always constantly somebody there to remind you that you are who you are. And so if you're not lucky enough to have cultivated a community of allies or like-minded people or people in similar situations where you can have that catharsis, where you can unpack all of that stuff, you never have a break. You never receive that release that gaming is supposed to provide.
Thank you, Cicero. And Trey, I would like to also pass that question on to you.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful answer. And I think I would only add that when we think about gaming and escape, like, for example, I love playing The Sims. I've always loved playing The Sims. I've been playing The Sims for 20 years. The Sims has been out for 20 years. And it is definitely one of those games where it's fantasy, it's utopian. You actually can have access to the American dream in The Sims. You work hard and boom, you have success, right? That's not the case in reality. As many of us know. So yes, if I need to unwind, if I need that catharsis that Cicero is talking about, even if I haven't played The Sims in like 6 months, and I'm just feeling stressed out and I want something that feels a little mindless, but I know will also be relaxing, I could go to The Sims. The thing is even in The Sims, there are codes and symbols and belief systems hardwired into the very fabric of what that game is. So while I, as a person of color, find it a space of respite, a space that is cathartic, and I can unwind and relax if I've had a stressful day, I'm also aware that there's other meanings being cultivated. So let's take some of the original Sims games, because there have been so many iterations, and you didn't have people of color in the default neighborhoods, right? So you had the Pleasants, you had the Goths, you had some classic Sims families, but there was very little to no racial diversity in some of those default early neighborhoods. So that's already signaling and sending messages to me, a person of color who's going to The Sims to relax. So I just want to add that, yes, we hope that gaming can be many things. Digital games, tabletop games, board games are often places where we connect with other people, where we unwind, but always in the background, meaning is being produced, and disseminated, and we're taking that in. And so when you have these moments of extreme state violence, anti-Black racism at work, it's the world around us that we live in, that we circulate in. Games are naturally going to absorb that too. They're going to absorb those symbols and those codes and those meanings hardwired into the very fabric of what those games are doing. And when we form communities around those spaces or in those spaces, quite often we're going to see, and we have seen, people online talking about what's happening in the world around us, right? So there isn't always that separation. Even when you're there to unwind and relax, you may be there to connect with like-minded people, and therefore you feel safer to talk about some of the things that are unjust and weighing heavily on you. So you have your community of friends that you can talk to while you're live streaming something, while you're playing. So I just want to kind of throw that out there, that even though a lot of times games are digital games, video games especially, people are like, hey, you're reading too much into it. You can't read too much into it. There's meaning being produced constantly. Our children are taking in meanings, right at the surface of these works, and then sometimes deeper beneath the surface. We are as well. Nothing is neutral in that sense. And our lived experiences and our daily lives will show up in the games that we play, even when, and especially when we need a break, right?
Right, thank you. And it's not just in gaming also. Vic, I know when we had conversations about this, you mentioned also anime and other areas where this is very relevant. Could you tell us about that here, please?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, love anime, love games, but I've always realized where I go to discover my anime and games, there's tons of forums with conversation that I'd probably not want to be a part of. So with these smaller communities, I remember just having someone send me to a site and they were like, yeah, you should go to 4chan to find out about new anime. And I was like, I'm not going to 4chan. I already know what it is. But just because of sites and conversations that happen there. But Dragon Ball Z is probably one of the things that everyone loves. And I look at Goku and I'm like, wow, this privileged guy, he comes from another planet. He assumes the identity of other people. And he takes power from everyone and has never won a fight, but is still the hero. But then you think about Piccolo, and Piccolo's a Black guy. To me, Piccolo is a Black guy, for sure.
100%.
You're right, he got the voice and everything, but he's never given the light and all those things like that. So continuing to just watch anime and see those tropes written in, kind of what Trey is saying, and then paralleling that to the gaming community. And I know you talked about the orcs from D&D, and we brought up community and how there was the one episode where the Spanish teacher dresses up as a drow, and then Shirley's like, so we're not going to talk about this at all. So there are things like that people hint at, and it really happens. You know, I remember the first time I sat at a gaming table and someone's like, you're a rogue, right? A thief? And I was like, no, I'm a cleric. So I'm not going to heal you when you need me. So let's deal with that later. So it's just things like that. And especially now, my local comic book shop reopened, and I don't like going into places that have large walls and hidden corners. All the Dungeons and Dragons items and all the role-playing things are in the back corner. I probably won't go there. Like even grabbing the items I grabbed for you all, it was in the back corner. I didn't want to look like I'm taking something while wearing a mask. So now I have to go in the stores, wear a mask, and I already look like I don't belong there. So whoever's having a conversation in a forum or at a back table with their friends, there's going to be that perception of me when I walk in a store, and I feel like that. And again, I'm in Massachusetts, and the only thing more than white folks here, we're here, are trees. So like, I'm outnumbered.
Okay, I'm not even going to go off of Massachusetts, but hey, that was beautiful. I always say the snow is not the dominant whiteness in Massachusetts, because we get a lot of snow, but there's a lot of whiteness in the Northeast. The so-called liberal Northeast. But right, sorry.
So-called.
Thank you so much, Trey, Cicero, and Vic. Now let's actually take a look at what some of these terms are, and we're going to now come to Jess for helping us to define what is implicit bias and racism, and how can we begin to examine our own implicit biases.
Great. Well, thanks, y'all. I think so. Just to give a heads up, we could spend like years talking about each one of these in different spaces. I'm gonna try not to take up too much time and do this more so just like how it shows up. But before I define racism, I think I'll get into implicit bias, so we can talk a little bit about that, because I was already hearing some of these things coming out just in hearing from Cicero, Trey, and Vic, even how it shows up when you show up to a gaming community. The fact that Vic said somebody just automatically assumed who he was when he showed up to the table was an implicit bias showing up in that exact person. So for implicit bias, it's also known as like an unconscious bias or a hidden bias. Is normally negative associations that people unknowingly hold. So sometimes implicit biases can be explicit, like it could just be said out loud, similar to what Vic just said, but sometimes implicit biases are just things that are happening in your brain that you don't even recognize that you're holding a bias against someone, just purely based off of what it is. And I have a whole training that actually Vic helped do, so he's actually the expert in this piece, but that would speak to specifically how your brain, it's an immediate hardwired necessity for your brain to categorize things, because there's too many things in the world for our brain to compute what's happening. So the very same synapses that make you look at a chair and decide that that's a chair, even though it's not like a chair you've ever seen, but you see it has 4 legs and it has a back and something you sit on, those same synapses in your brain that do that cause implicit biases. And you learn these things because of things that you see in the world. So when you're talking about the fact that in media, when the original Sims didn't have any people of color, you immediately assume, okay, this Sims is for white people, because your brain's making an immediate assumption of what is allowed within this space. The issue with implicit biases is we don't know that they're happening, one. So oftentimes that can be explicit, like I said, it's more direct. We can talk about racism in a minute. But a lot of the times the way it shows up is things like the gender pay equity gap. We see that when women are hired over men, that they could have the same exact qualifications, same exact education, and women are still paid on average. We won't talk about women of color versus white men, because that's a whole different conversation. But on average, for women across the board, it's 80 cents for every dollar that a man's paid. Now, whoever's hiring is not sitting there being like, oh, that's a woman, I'm going to pay her less. That's not what's happening. There's this implicit bias that's coming across, and it shows up in different ways. And so I use the gender conversation to start us out with, because I haven't gotten to race and racism yet. And sometimes gender is easier to talk about, and people are more willing to have that conversation. But the same thing happens with implicit biases. We see this when you're more willing to talk to a white stranger than you are to a Black stranger on the street. It can show up in lots of different ways. You might cross the street because you have a bias based off of what you saw in some movies or what you've heard in certain areas of the neighborhood. You might avoid certain spaces purely based off of biases that you've been taught in society. Now, implicit biases can be a result of racism and systemic racism. Earlier, Jamie, you talked about that. So we'll talk about how they're connected in just a second. But first, I'm going to define racism. So typically, the scholarly way of defining racism is power plus racial prejudice equals racism. Now, I'm going to skip over power because I could spend 2 days just talking about power. And that has more to do with class. It has to do with the current structure of how our country is set up and other countries are set up. But we're going to deconstruct racial prejudice because normally people are pretty familiar with those two words. So I'm going to actually start with prejudice. So we're going to break it apart. We have pre and judge to create prejudice. So pre, before, so when you first see something, judge, you judge something. So you're just prejudging. You're just gonna, and you could do that about a book. You can do that about a person. You can do that about anything. You can do that about food that you see on a menu when you go into a restaurant. So you're just prejudging. Now, racial prejudice, now we have to understand what race is. So I haven't even gotten to the actual racism part. So race, when we think about what race is, I think it's important for people to recognize, and this might be a little controversial, but race is actually a false classification of people that's not really actually based on any real data. So a lot of people are confused by that. Now, I'm just going to give you a bunch of resources. I'm going to throw them out there because I don't have time to completely deconstruct it for you. But I would encourage you to go watch the film Race, The Power of an Illusion. It's a PBS documentary. It will go through how the false classification of race was created and why. And the scientists who have said out loud, that was false science. We did that because we had to prove that some categorizations of people were over a different class. Now let's think about it. Let's go back to when before race existed, before that term existed. Think about our founding fathers, specifically in this country. When they came over, they were escaping religious persecution. And at the time, there were slaves. Now, there were white indentured servants, but if you remember from your history class, white indentured servants could work their way out of slavery. But there was also slaves that were being brought over forcibly from Africa. Now, if you were fleeing from persecution, and you're doing this on your Christian morals, you have to come up with a reason on why it's okay that one, we've mass murdered indigenous people coming to this land, and two, why it's okay that I have slaves that are Black. And so the construct of race was created to make that okay, because that gave them power in this new society that they were building. They were building this new society, and they finally had the power when they had previously been persecuted, and they needed to create a reason on why it was okay that they still had these slaves, because it was free labor that allowed them to be in the seats of power that they had. This is where that power is coming into play. And so they asked scientists to go and prove it. So these scientists went, and if you're a scientist and you say, my goal is to prove that Black people are inferior to whites, of course, they're going to find a way to do it. They measured some skulls. They did all these things. They classified people into what are now the categorizations that we would call race. And so if you combine that, what it did was it said that white people are morally superior to basically everyone else. And I would encourage you to read Ibram Kendi's other book called Stamped from the Beginning, which actually goes through how race and the concept of white people actually changed over time. And they did it through laws. The Supreme Court would be like, oh, Asian people are all white. So at one point in our history, those that we view as Asian were considered white. And then they're like, oh, hold on, they're a little too brown. So we're going to change that. And now all of a sudden, race is no longer about where you're from in the world. It's about what color your skin is. And so it's changed over time in order to ensure the people who had power could stay in power. So think about that for just a minute. And so if racism equals if you have to have power plus racial prejudice, and racial prejudice can show up in lots of different ways. People of color could have racial prejudice. You could be saying bigoted, discriminatory, terrible things all the time. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're racist. It doesn't equal racism because there has to be power within that. Now we could deconstruct this even more, but Jamie, you did talk about systemic racism. And since I talked a little bit about our history, I want to make sure we're talking about systemic racism a lot in the media. And we're saying that oftentimes the Black women and men that are being done down is due to systemic racism. Now, I just talked about how race was created to give certain people power, in this case, white individuals, and oppress people of color over time, basically by passing laws. And so systemic racism, if that's how our country was built, that is now embedded into everything that we are. It's embedded into our Constitution. It's embedded into every single system that was created in this country. So without knowing it, we've created an entire society that has systemic racism infused because it's in every policy, procedure, training, any system that's built in this country has that as its roots. And so when you're talking about systemic racism, it's not actually about the individual cop. Everyone always says like, oh, but whatever, not all cops are bad, like all these things. It has nothing to do with the people. It has to do with the system that brought up these individuals and what results in implicit biases. We just talked about how we all have them, and it's because we grew up in this society where systemically, every system that we talk to or we're engaged with, from the education system to the police system to where we decide our media system, all of those systems were built upon a racial fabric. And so it's impossible to undo. And it's important for us to recognize the only way to actually rid racism from our country is to address systemically and undo it from the very beginning. So what can we do to undo these systems? Because a lot of times we actually have zero control over how those racial systems are being perpetrated. So that's a high level definition. We can talk very deeply for a much longer period of time on this. And I'm sure I got lots of questions on what those were, but I wanted to give kind of an overlay of what we're talking about.
Thank you. And it reminds me of my own journey. I've taken the Harvard implicit bias test. If you're interested in examining your own implicit biases, look up the Harvard IAT. And I grew up in predominantly brown neighborhoods my entire life until about 2.5 years ago when I moved to Chicago. And when I took the implicit Harvard's test, I scored with a slight automatic preference for white people. And that floored me because I literally only grew up in predominantly brown communities. And so I started to examine that, and I thought of my childhood and how I remember a time where I didn't like my brown skin. I wanted to be lighter. And I'm half Filipino, half Salvadorian. And in the Philippines, till this day, if you go into the store, there are aisles and aisles of bar soaps that are specifically for skin whitening. And I remember wanting that and having that soap as a kid and just hoping that I could be a little lighter because of the implications of having brown skin meant that you were less than. And as a child, I recognized that, but didn't know why. And so then that's how I started to make the connection as I looked into that. And so now, taking this bias and this racism that we just talked about generally, I would like to ping this back to TreaAndrea. How does bias and racism show up in the gaming community? Specifically, is there systemic bias and racism in the games industry? Where does that all stem from? And how does this impact the culture of gaming? Heavy question, I know.
Yeah, that was a heavy question, but Jessica did such an excellent job of kind of introducing and synthesizing what some of these things mean, what some of these terms mean: systemic racism, bias, the sort of historical factors, race as a fiction, race as a construct, right? So the short answer is yes. Bias, racism exists in gaming communities, in games industries. Yes, absolutely. We probably wouldn't be here today talking about this topic if the answer were no.
Right.
So there's so many ways in which you'll see this. I mean, when we think about systemic racism, which, in this case, I'm thinking kind of narrowly, but we can broaden this as well. Games themselves are systems, right? So that's a nice kind of parallel, I think, to think about when we think about legal systems and we think about, institutional like racism and bias in our cultural, economic, and legal systems. All of that exists, right? When you talk about systemic racism, that let's just give a concrete example. We've given a few other examples, but let's say you go and you want to get a loan from a bank, to open a small business, to start a small business, and people take a look at who you are, what you look like, your class, where you live, where's your address. All of these factors start to go into the decision-making process. And historically, this has been the case, right? That one person with a certain profile who is African-American, who's indigenous, who's Latinx, could be denied, more than likely could be denied for the same loan that a white person, let's say a white male and even white female might get, right? So that the factors that go into determining that are all functions of the systemic racism that we're talking about. You won't get the loan, or if you do get the loan, you're going to have a really high interest rate, right? So you're going to pay even more on that loan. So, these are some examples of systemic racism at work. How does that show up in games? Well, as I said, games are systems. They use rules, they use structures, they build on our assumptions culturally of what we think we know about who people are and what they're capable of doing. Values, right? Those are all encoded and all right at the surface. Again, The Sims is a good example of those early neighborhoods in The Sims not being racially diverse at all, right? So the default options were for non-Black, non-Indigenous characters. That's what the game offers you. And then even when you would go ahead and create and try to customize a family that maybe looks like your family, you had very limited options. You might have like one Black skin tone, and maybe like an afro for hair, and that's it. So you couldn't even really visualize difference. You couldn't visualize racial difference in that way. So, when we think about how does systemic racism show up in games and the gaming communities, there are at least 4 ways. There's probably many more ways to think about this, but I'm just kind of breaking them up into 4 categories. Education. So that's access to education. And I say education is important, not only because I'm a professor, but because a lot of our digital games, for example, and our media, has been started as an idea or as a part of someone's training, right? So you go to school, you get certain degrees, you train to enter a particular industry. And so access to education, affordable education, access to educate certain fields like computer science, if we're talking about digital games, but even if you're talking about just storytelling games, having access to the cultural educational systems that help inform and train people who are going to make games. So that's one level in which we could sort of track and talk about biases. Who has access? Who's getting into these programs? Can you afford these programs? Who's getting the loans? What are the interest rates, right? So there's a sort of spiral. You can spiral outward and think about all the levels at which racism and bias could impact someone's educational access, right? Which is an entry point to many of these industries. And then you have industry. So let's say you get the degree and you have a background in computer science. You can do some programming, or you're an artist and you can do some visual design and you want to, work in the games industry. Well, the numbers are not in your favor. If you're a person of color, if you're a woman, if you're a queer person of color and a woman, I think it's something like 83% of executives in tech fields are white. All right, white people. So that tells you there that you're going to be isolated at the very least, and your opportunities are going to be more limited depending on your background. So when we talk about systemic bias and racism, that second level is industry. You have education, you have industry, and then you have the level of representation, which is what I've been talking about with The Sims so much, is what do we actually see and engage with the stories of the game worlds themselves. So at the level of representation, would we say there's bias at work? Yes, right? The Sims is a good sort of go-to example for that, but you think of other narrative games, right, where people of color in lead roles in narrative games. There's lots of case studies, lots of examples of this. How rare this is. You think of a game like Mafia 3, which is still one of the most meaningful games I've played, doesn't tend to do as well commercially, right? But also, it's one of very few games where you could play as a sort of a lead person of color as the centerpiece of that story. So the third level here would be representation. And then the fourth level, or the fourth arena, which we could talk about bias and racism, is among the players and the fans, the fan communities themselves, where you have hostile environments for people of color, for women, especially online. So there's notorious examples there. You have moments like Gamergate. You've got people of color being harassed and policed online when they want to play games, or when they speak up and say, hey, this game is whack in this way, or I really support this game, right? You have gatekeepers and people policing and targeting, both on and offline harassment. So those are the four levels, or the four arenas I could think of to talk about, does systemic racism exist in the gaming industry and gaming communities? Yes. And those are sort of ways to break that down. Why? Well, again, it's because everything is cyclical and everything is connected. We don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a bubble. We don't play in a bubble. We don't play in a vacuum. So the same experiences and attitudes and values that people have offline are going to show up in their leisure spaces and culture. So I think that, that's pretty much how I would think about that. Pretty big question, but yes, systemic bias exists in gaming, in the games industry, in games journalism, in games culture, and there are any number of ways that we could talk about that some more.
May I put a pin on that as well? I want to give an example to both speak to Jamie, your question, and also talk about how people can right their wrongs, and all within the same franchise. So there's a franchise by a developer called Ubisoft called Watch Dogs. The original Watch Dogs game released a few years back and took place in Chicago, a place several of the people here on the panel know very, very well. And one of the things that they were Ubisoft was touting, was how accurate Chicago was. They came to Chicago, they filmed different things, they took pictures, blah, 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 and they, even built out neighborhoods. And in the game, you play as this protagonist, and I affectionately call this guy Ubisoft guy, because it's a white guy, mid-30s, 5 o'clock shadow, kind of scruffy looking, and his name was Aiden something or whatever. But he was an ethical hacker, or he was a hacker.
Aiden Pierce.
Aiden Pierce. There you go. Yeah. And so he was a hacker, and he went around and he was righting the wrongs and saving his niece and doing the things and blah 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 blah. And the whole point of the game was that you can go ahead and hack anything. And so you didn't have to be lethal. You didn't have to kill people. You could hack their communication system. You could shock them by hacking overloading something, or some whatever it is that you could do. So you're going around all these neighborhoods, and you go and you're in the loop. You're in the downtown Chicago area, and it's faithfully recreated. You go north of the city and you get into the suburbs, and you see people in their neighborhoods and stuff like that. When you go to the south side, and most of us who are from Chicago know that Chicago is a very, very segregated city, in very terrible ways. But you go to the south side of Chicago for in this game, and you see, it's more depressed. It is classically urban. But what you wind up seeing is your first sense and view of Black people within the Watch Dogs universe. And your real first introduction to them is them beatboxing on the corner with a radio. because that's what Black people do, right? And then, you know, and as I said before, that you can go in and you can hack all sorts of things. So you can take non-lethal avenues to try and succeed in a mission, except for the one mission that took place in their analog of the projects of Cabrini Green, where you had to take down an entire drug apartment complex. And in that, there's a cutscene that happens, and as soon as that cutscene takes place, or actually as soon as you get to the grounds, the only way to get through everything is to murder everyone, murder all the brown people. And honestly, it really doesn't happen in that way in any other aspect of the game. And I think actually Trey was on an episode of Spawn on Me where we talked about this game, and you know, the roller coaster ride that was enjoying it, and then seeing how they represented me in the game, and we took them to task for that. A few years later, they came out with a sequel, Watch Dogs 2. They completely did a 180 in terms of how they represented things. This time, the concept was basically the same, but this time you were in San Francisco, and this time your protagonist was a young Black man. And he was the person, save very, very few missions, that every single player that played that game, and it did really well commercially and critically, every person that played that game had to play as this character. And there was a moment in that game where, he was a young tech guy, worked at a Google analog, and there's one mission in the game where he has to go back to work and steal something, and he runs into the other Black guy that happens to work there, and they have a conversation about being Black in tech, which spoke directly to me, because I'm a Black person in tech. And, my background is I've been a Unix system admin for probably longer than some people that are watching this have been alive. But the thing is that they came out, and Ubisoft came out with their franchise, and they had a portrayal not only of a character, but a portrayal of a city and portrayals of the people within that city that was repugnant. And the way that they had you as the player interact with those people was reprehensible, and they went ahead and in a sequel was able to fix that. And those are the things that I think we need to start seeing, calling out, and then seeing and helping work with people to make sure that those things kind of change. And part of the way that changes is by getting people that look like the characters that are in the game be part of the decision making, or be part of that conversation about how people are presented and represented within this medium.
This is a great segue to the next question, which we're now going to look at new terms. Jess, would you say that what Ubisoft did was that along the lines of anti-racism? And what even is anti-racism? Is it enough to just not be a racist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you. That was a great example, Cicero. I think even as you were talking, you can see how, sorry, I'll get to your question in a sec. My brain was like, there's so much systemic racism in that example alone, and you spoke to part of it, but the other part was like the fact that our society, like the reason why the West Side or the South Side of Chicago looks the way it does is due to the systems that made that possible. So that oppress the communities that live there. The reason why you always know when you're in the hood, no matter what city you are in this nation, is because of how systemic racism is at play. And it shows up in our movies and games and all of those different pieces, and we don't even realize it. I mean, that's just something that we just know. Like, I'd encourage everybody to look at the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They have a 2-day Undoing Institutional Racism workshop. And they spend a whole day talking about why do you know you're in the hood when you're in the hood. It might have a different name. It might be the barrio. It might be how do you know? And those are the systems that are at play that show you all those different pieces. I love the example of how they were really speaking to representation and what it means to represent different people of color in the Watchdog 2 example. And so when I think about what anti-racism is, I would say, no, it's not enough just to say, of course I'm not a racist. Everybody's going to say they're not a racist. Like, unless you are just like repugnant, going like straight up white supremacy, then you are going to, of course, always say, of course, I'm not a racist. I'm not purposely trying to be, I'm not those people. Maybe people that we see on the news that are currently leading our country saying some crazy things, but I am. I'm not purposely trying to do that. Being anti-racist is actually taking the time to promote anti-racist ideas, recognizing when racism is showing up, and then actively doing something to undo that. And in some spaces, you might not be in a place of power where you can undo the systemic pieces, but you can work to ensure that people of color's voices are at the table. As Cicero and both shared, you can work to ensure that even in hiring practices, wherever you're working, that you're ensuring that people of color's voices are at the table and making those decisions. You can ensure that when you hear somebody say something, you're actively saying something against it and explaining why. You can have those conversations within your family. Anti-racist, I would say, it's not something that you like claim as yourself. I wouldn't like, oftentimes when people talk about allies and things like that, they're like, we say like, you can't be an ally and just be like, yo, I'm an ally, check out my button, let's go. Like, we're good now. You can be safe around me. The same is true when you're saying you're being anti-racist. I actually think it's more important that people of color see you as an anti-racist when your actions are actually showing that. So it's actively being, having these conversations, not shying away from them, and also taking accountability when you mess up. Because oftentimes, like, we're all going to mess up. Like, people are going to say something that's incorrect. I say something, I've been doing this work for many years now, and I mess up all the time. But part of my role is in attempting to undo racist principles is I have to be willing to hear when I'm wrong and hold myself accountable to that. Because I don't want to perpetuate anti-Blackness. If I see that, we should be calling it out and trying to overcome that. So I would say in that example, they're trying to overcome those in the spaces that they actually have control within it. So yeah.
Thank you, Jess. And that also is going to be a great segue to the next question. Before we get there, though, friendly reminder that if you have questions that you want to ask, hopefully we'll still have time at the end of this. I know we're running a little behind because of such deep, great conversations. There is a link where you can submit questions that I'll be able to read here if we still have time for Q&A at the end. So we just talked about anti-racism and what that means, and about allyship and what that actually should mean. So now we would like to hear from Jenna first and then Jud on your experiences of unlearning as you are looking to be better allies to communities of color. And how have your perspectives changed since you've started your journey of unlearning?
Man, that's a deep question.
It is.
And it's a long journey. You know, when I was a kid, I grew up in a really diverse community. I had all kinds of different friends on my block. And then we moved to a predominantly white community. And I had a whole bunch of white friends and really didn't know how to function for a little bit. I had to kind of relearn. I was the only white kid in my little group of friends. And then there were no people of color. And that was a little jarring for me growing up. And then as I got into college, you know, things were a little bit more diverse. And I always, like many people do, say, you know, I'm a progressive. I have a Black friend, might have a Black boyfriend. I'm not a racist. And then I realized that's not necessarily the case. You know, a lot of my family is actively racist. Or is kind of perpetuating the system. And I had to just kind of figure out for myself, like, where I was in the spectrum. And I think if you're lucky enough to win that book or to buy that book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, you'll see as a white person, you're always going to be on the spectrum. Really, as any person, you're going to be on the spectrum. Sometimes I say racist things. Sometimes I think from a place of white supremacy. When I started working with youth, I thought I was going to go in and save the day. Started working in Black communities and not really asking people what they need. I was prescribing what I thought they needed, just, depending, just seeing what I saw, not even understanding the systemic racism that got things there in the first place, and not being smart enough to ask those questions. So I had to very, very good friends and very good mentors that said, hold on a minute, sister, you got to pump those brakes. And some really good people that I worked with in the NAACP that just took me aside and knew that I had some genuine motivations, but I was just going about it the wrong way. So I had to really just take that in. And I'm going to say some stupid things here tonight. So when you're working as an anti-racist or working as a person who's unlearning that, you just have to be willing to say the stupid things and be willing, like Jessica said, to be gracious enough to go, you know what? Yeah, you're right. That wasn't right. And I'm going to unlearn that. I'm going to learn how to say it. I'm going to learn the roots behind what I said was wrong and not put that burden on people of color. I think that's another mistake that a lot of people make is, oh, please teach me. And that's not what we need to do. We need to look it up, just Google it, read different books. There's tons of stuff out there. I'm sure, Jamie, you and Jud are going to make some resources available. There's so many things out there that you can unlearn, and just kind of unlearning. We don't have all the answers, and we need to work together actively and not prescribe, not try to fix, not try to be that white savior, but do speak out, do interrupt the times that you are hearing those things. When they feel wrong in your spirit, say something. And that's really important.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Two quick books I would recommend is White Fragility and also Waking Up White. And real quickly, Jud, I know we're running out of time, but we still want to hear from you a little bit on your journey of unlearning.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was definitely in the camp of kind of what Jenna was saying. Like, I'm a good person. I have a lot of friends of color. Like, I'm definitely actively teaching and making sure that my children are not being brought up with any biases or racism that I could, be aware of. I'm starting to learn that there are things that I had no idea about. And I think that to me is and getting back to the systemic racism, that to me is the kind of the biggest eye-opener since this movement really took hold recently and it's pulled a lot of people along who probably weren't actively taking a look at this before. And I've had a lot of friends sending me things to look at, and I'm shocked to see the level of the institutionalized racism, the way that the system has really been built from the ground up, so that people of color just don't, it's beyond not even having a fair shot. It's like, it's so weighted against people of color to achieve that dream that we're all supposedly trying to do. And so these realizations have really blown me away. And I think that's a big part of why, we're putting a lot of energy as a show. And this is our chance to kind of stand up and say, this is what we want. We want to help. We want to learn. We want to educate. We want to use whatever little exposure that the Role Players has right now to help educate our fans and the other people out there. Because I think education is definitely a big component of this for the good people out there that were already trying to just like, oh, I'm a good person, so I'm not perpetuating racism. But I've seen now that it's going to take a lot more than that. It's going to take more than just the Black community rallying to make these changes, because again, a lot of it's institutionalized, and a lot of those institutions are held not by people of color. So I think it's going to take allies across the board. And so all of these realizations have just been hitting me, like slapping me in the face left and right. And like, I think my biggest fear tonight was to come on here and say something stupid, because I don't have any, I feel like I'm the only person on this board that has like no training in equity or, you know, diversity or any of that, other than my hope and my passion for such things. But I am definitely hoping to just kind of unlearn anything that might still be hardwired. And actually, I'll give an example that is from the LGBTQ kind of experience, of something that's so hardwired that this moment, this was years ago, that really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of my own biases that I'm holding on to. I grew up mostly in Virginia on the East Coast, and didn't have a lot of people of color around when I was in, like, all the way up until probably like 12 to 15, somewhere in there. It was mostly white communities that I grew up in. And I was working with this this man who joined our company who is gay, and we were talking at one point, and we're talking about something that was really stupid. I'm like, oh, that's so gay. And as I said it, I'm like, no, reel it back in. And he's like, oh, that's so tall. I'm like, yes, I can't believe I said that. I'm astounded that, and I look back in my childhood, and I remember everybody said it. And I never once as a kid thought about it being a homosexual reference, but now I'm standing in front of somebody where this has real impact. And I was like, wow, I can't believe that. And I'll never forget that moment, because he's a dear friend and he's an amazing person. And he helped educate me through that process. So now I've been kind of unpacking and learning that. So I'm hoping to do the same thing here. And even with the role players, when we started forming up, I really wanted it to be a diverse cast. And we had gone out to several people of color and said, hey, we'd really like to have you on the show. And we had, you know, we were looking friends of friends. You had to be an actor kind of to start, and hopefully be a D&D fan. It wasn't a requirement, but we were hoping that somebody would be into D&D. And we had several people of color say, no, I don't want to do it. And we kept looking, and then our kind of cast moved forward, and we have diversity in some other ways. Azar is Persian, and, you know, we have men and women, and we have different age groups, but we don't have that person of color. And somebody recommended this woman that I should get in touch with. This is a terrible story. This is me trying to do the right thing, where it went horribly awry. One of our players met this woman at a comedy show and said, this woman is hilarious. And she overheard her talking about D&D. And she was a woman of color. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. Not about I didn't know the woman of color thing, but I'm like, oh my God, a comedian who is talking about D&D in public. I mean, that's what we want. And so I reached out, and I'm like, oh, she's a person of color. I'm like, that's great, because we were looking to have a diverse cast. And she's like, oh, I'm not interested. Like, before we were having this great conversation back and forth, she's like, I'm not going to be your tokenized person of color on your cast. I'm like, no. That's not what I wanted to do. And I was just like, I felt terrible. And I started explaining more and more what I meant and what I was trying to do. And she's like, okay, I get it. I understand what you're trying to do. It's okay. But it didn't work out for different reasons. But that's something I want to ask. And like, how do I, for people who want to make sure that we're being inclusive, and we want to make sure we're bringing people of color to different groups, whether it's a company or a gaming group, how do we do that without tokenizing those individuals and yet still making sure that those people are represented? That would be something I would love to learn, because obviously I screwed that up terribly.
I think part of it, as you were telling the story, it reminded me of a conversation, a little peek behind the curtains for everyone that's listening and watching right now. A couple of days ago, we all got together and had a conversation, kind of a meet and greet with everyone. And there was a conversation that came up that I kind of spearheaded that led to us having a conversation about maybe adding that as a question. And I won't illuminate what the conversation was about, but what I will say is that my answer was, I don't want that question to be asked, because just like that person, people of color, because we are perpetually victims, and that, and that's something, as Jessica talked about, how it's a lot easier for people to understand systemic issues and implicit biases when it comes to gender. I can use that same analogy here, because irrespective of whether or not you're racist, you're a bigot, what have you, everyone knows a woman. Everyone cares about women in their lives. So they have a better understanding of how, either irrespective of they're a man or woman or non-binary, they understand how life and the places that we live and how we've acculturated to society can negatively impact how we see women in general, whether you're a woman, whether you're non-binary, whether you're a guy. But also for people of color, we have been victimized. So we protect ourselves from potentially, you won't openly and actively put yourself in a position to be victimized again. And that is, that's basically what this woman was saying was, I'm not going to fill a checkbox for you. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be that person for you. What I want to be is me, who's a hilarious comedian that loves D&D, who also happens to be a person of color. But for you as an ally who is looking to show representation, show diversity, show other Black comedians who love D&D or may not love D&D, but can learn to love D&D, that this table is okay for me, this game is okay for me, is very important. And I think, how you combat that is by taking it head on and saying, look, I'm not, look, I know we don't have any people of color at our table, and I'm not trying to make you the token. I want people of color at my table. Like, I want those different ideas. I want those at my table, and I want you to be able to be at our table, have a good time, and still feel like you have agency. And if you present it that way first, I think the person is less likely to look at you as someone who may be doing this for their own means, as opposed to, selfish, malicious means, as opposed to your own selfish desires, which is, hey, I want to play with different people, which is selfish and magnanimous at the same time. So those are things that you kind of have to weigh. But like D&D just in general is something I just started playing 2 years ago. Trey has never played, but I know Trey and I know that she would love D&D. But the thing is, when you grow up in communities of color, it's always been something, like being a sci-fi nerd or an anime nerd when you're growing up, or a comic book nerd when you're growing up, especially in communities of color, puts you kind of like you're kind of off in the nerd corner when being a nerd wasn't really cool. But D&D was always a level of nerddom that just did not exist. It was always white people stuff. Like, that was something that did not exist in communities of color. And as an adult, I've run into several, and still only a handful of Black and brown folks who have been playing D&D their entire lives, have been rolling dice their entire lives. And I look at them like unicorns, like they are actual characters out of D&D, like they're mythical creatures, because you couldn't get more nerdy than me when I was a kid, but I still was too cool for D&D. So like, and that's, again, it goes back to representation. It is the thing, and we won't ask this question, but I'll talk about it anyway, Jamie. It's the reason that Rivals of Waterdeep is so important. It's the reason that the Spawn on Me podcast was so important. Or is so important. It's still around, even though I'm not on it. It's because when you see yourself doing something, you can see yourself doing something. And so, represent, like, it cannot be understated how much representation matters. And not only does it matter to us, but it also matters to you, Jud, because when we become normalized, when you see 7-8 titles in a video game year that feature protagonists of color, when they could have been anybody, but the developers chose a protagonist of color. When you see stories that are being told from the perspective of people of color that are just great stories, they're not stories about pre-colonial Hawaii. They're stories about, they're just great stories featuring great characters. When that becomes normalized, then people become people, and the default isn't white, which is what it is right now. And that's why representation is so important.
Add something, Cicero. When I'm consulting for companies and they want people of color, or they're actively recruiting, sometimes it's hard. And folks, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I know from just working with my friends of color in the Y and outside of the Y, it's really hard to be the only person in the department. It's hard to be the only person of color in marketing, the only person of color. And all of a sudden it's, oh, would you be interested in being on our diversity and inclusion committee? Well, I got some other talents here. So putting the burden just on one person to be that voice can be difficult. So, as people are recruiting, if there's anybody watching tonight that is in a place to hire or in a position of power, or, is creating a video game, it's not just about the one person. It's trying to because then that person's always the one that everyone's going to. Oh, is this okay? Is this representative of your community? And it's just a burden. It's a burden. It's tough.
And if there was an understatement ever, it was that one.
There are so many great points that are brought up, and I love Cicero talking about video games in particular. And I know Trey brought up being able to change and customize your characters. Video games have come a long way, because I remember in the early 90s being Mustafa Cairo, or having to be DJ before I could be Akuma and things like that. But D&D, again, to so many of the points, was so far out of my spectrum, because the rules to my house were no friends can be over, no one could be at the kitchen table, and you can't go to your friends' houses. So all I could do was borrow video games at school. So when I started playing tabletop and Pathfinder more specifically, I would go to game shops, and I'd have to drive 20, 30 minutes just to get there. And I'd sit in the car for about 10 minutes being, please let there be another Black person there, because if there is, I know I'm safe. Like, that was the first one.
Wow.
And then secondly, I'd be like, okay, I hope these folks don't ask me the question, like, do you know where you're supposed to be? This is Pathfinder. I'm like, yeah, it's on your website. I even sent the comment, said I'm here at this time. But there's always that. But one of the things I've always done, and I think in the conversation you had with this woman, was like, I kept these in the chamber. If anything was ready to happen, I was going to chuck the deuces and I was going to walk out the door, because I didn't have time for that. This was supposed to be my space to just hang out on a Saturday morning for 4 or 5 hours and get away from the world. Not only like escapism, I could be someone else and whoever it is. And it even goes back to online gaming. When I played World of Warcraft for 3 years, I did never use a mic. I only typed into, because people could hear my language, my accent, things like that. So chat box all day, Quasar the king, this is who you're going to hear from, and that's it. So it's real difficult thinking about the way you can get into this world, but the world isn't prepared for you, and how long you're going to be there. It's really difficult. And if you love the game, you'll be there. So there are many people, and looking at these platforms that we have now, YouTube and all these other places, like, it's great to see that the community is expanding.
Twitch.
Oh, yeah.
Twitch.
And Jud,
FYI, I don't have social media or anything. Sorry.
He really doesn't.
Smart man. Smart man.
I think folks are saying a lot of the same things, but I'll also say, as a person of color, we're used to being the only. Like, so the other piece is, I always say, it's when we're trying to go about this, like, how would you build a relationship with anyone? Like, if you have this common interest, like, just focus on that. Just the other day, I was talking to a group of women of color, and we're like, well, we want to be hired because we're qualified, but I think that can translate into gaming. So if, like, your passion is D&D, I think inviting people in, and it's more about the culture of when people of color get there. Like, people of color are used to being the only person of color, especially, and I'm just making an assumption. I haven't played D&D personally, but I'm going to make an assumption purely based off of everything I've seen on TV and things, that I would assume a person of color is going to assume they're going to be the only person of color when they walk in. Like, that's already, they don't need anyone to confirm that that's what's going to happen. And so I think you're going to show up that way anyways. And so to me, I think what they're looking for is this a culture where I can be who I am? Like, can I be myself? And I say that to organizations and spaces elsewhere. I'm like, you're trying to seek more diversity in your workplace, then there's a reason there's no people of color there. Like, people of color are used to knowing when there's going to be a white dominant space. And if there's no one there, that's an internal world. You have to look at the systemic racism that comes. This is deeper than just like, oh, the one person. I'm like, there's something deeper within that that you have to address. Because if you create a space that is great, you can keep inviting people. They'll decide to stay when it's a space they feel like they can be themselves.
Yeah, just being genuine and authentic.
Yes. And when we look at the history of D&D and really how white dominated it is no surprise that it's, as you said, Jud, it can be hard to find folks of color who are willing to step into the space and to play. For myself, D&D was not an option growing up. I didn't know, I mean, I heard about it, but I didn't really know what it was, like the mythical camp. I never got to go to camps as a kid, didn't know what it was, also predominantly white space. And as a queer woman of color, I never saw anyone growing up who looks like me represented in a positive light, if they're represented at all. And now that's why this is so exciting. And I am so honored that we got to do this, because what makes this important for me is I get to be that vision for someone, for a younger person who didn't have what I had growing up, and that we can really work together to make these strides. And these conversations are so important. We have definitely run out of time. We've only got a few minutes left, but don't worry, we want to continue these conversations. This is not going to be a one and done for the role players. We are committed to these efforts. I mentioned earlier, we created a hashtag the role players 4 with the number 4 DEI for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We will be planning future panels like this one that will also expand to other topics. So please stay tuned and stay engaged. And we would love to have anyone here back again to cover the questions that we weren't able to get to today, because those are also great questions. And maybe we might have to make this 2 hours next time, because an hour and a half just wasn't enough time. So with that being said, it is now time to do our giveaway. So get ready and type in the chat box just the word community, and then our lovely Killer Panda will let us know who the winner is. And while you're all doing that, I do want to say a really, really big thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. It has been such an honor to have you here. Thank you for sharing your time tonight, your knowledge, and your experiences with us as we did this journey as we begin this journey of unlearning together. And also a special thank you to all of our viewers for also taking a chance on us and joining us for these conversations, which are often can be very raw, very vulnerable, and very uncomfortable. And it is in that discomfort is when we find the space to grow. If we don't have these conversations and we don't feel that pain, we're never going to learn individually or together. So thank you for that. And hopefully you're all typing community in the chat. KP, I have my Slack up. Let me know when you have somebody, hopefully soon. And while we're waiting for that last one also, let's see, Monday nights at 8 p.m. If you want to continue your relationship with the role players, but from the D&D side, join us as our DM Jud takes our players on their homebrew D&D journey in Anacroli. And Jud, if you could tell us, so the role players is also planning something else in addition to this series, in a creative way to help these efforts.
Oh, yes.
Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, we are hoping to put together a big charity game where we're going to get some people, some celebrities who have never played D&D before to come on, do a one-shot. It'll be a big charity fundraiser for Color of Change. And if you don't know Color of Change, they're an amazing organization. So go to colorofchange.org. Not only can you give some money to help, they have so many initiatives, but they make it really easy to take action on injustices against the Black community. So I've been a big believer in that organization since we found it. And so we're hoping to have a big charity stream and raise a lot of money for that organization. So that'll hopefully be coming up. And just come by and watch the show. We've been on for about 10 months now, and from day one, I made the world of Anacroli in our show. Except for all the like necromancers and terrible monsters and whatnot, it is a utopian in some way that I'm kind of like doing my own rewriting of what D&D had created. So there are elves that have dark skin and and that are good. I mean, not drow, just like the like the normal elves. And even to me, one of my favorite characters I've ever played is a drow who is not evil, who just believes that all drow are good and just corrupted by this spider queen. So if you know any of that lore. So what we've tried to do is create like in that world where sexual preference and identity and skin color have no bearing. These are not the things that differentiate people in this world. So it's little things like that I'm trying to do, but obviously we're trying to do a much bigger thing here with this panel and with our fundraisers in general.
Thank you so much, Jud. All right, hopefully you are all entering for your chance to win a copy of Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and those 3 one-shot adventures. Please make sure you are typing the word community in the chat box. And Ashley, we will wrap that up shortly. Sorry, KP, let me know.
Am I allowed to win the Starfinder? I really want that Starfinder book.
We'll find other
find some more.
Well, I'll get one online.
And for the record, I love playing Drow Renegades Gone Good, but it always bothered me that they had to be the Renegades Gone Good. So I'm glad that they're making changes to that and that also you've made efforts to address that in Anacroli. All right, so we have our winner for tonight. Congratulations to, I might butcher this, I apologize. Eat it, pal, or maybe I won't butcher it, but you are the winner for tonight. Please be sure
the auto horns.
Yes.
Please send a message to Killer Panda and send her your information. We will ship you your goods. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Again, it has been an honor to host this panel, an honor to have you all, our panelists and our viewers join us tonight. Look forward to this video also being on YouTube once we have it converted, and we will see you next time. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks again for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks again, all our panelists.
I'm waiting for my call to play.
Oh, you're gonna get it.
Nice.
And I still need to give it a try sometime, so looking forward to
I
it.
will send you dice. Send me I will send you dice.
Can we do a game? Can we do a game with this panel?
Yeah, I would definitely do that.
I don't even know how to play.
Yeah, we should 100%. We should play a game.
Yeah,
100%. We should just do a one shot.
that would be awesome.
Just so you guys get it. Yeah, just so you guys get a chance. So your stuff is homebrew. We can use like D&D Beyond, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So like we can get you on D&D Beyond. You don't even have to own anything.
No,
All you need is a website, a browser, and you can go to D&D Beyond, and you can build your character there, and you can roll your dice there, everything, just so you can get a try. Basically, like the way I describe D&D to people, especially people who have been skeptical of it, like there are lots of times where I've had conversations with other Black people that are around my age, our age, and talk about how much I love D&D and like we as adults, we are told so often, unless you're an actor or something like that, some type of artist, some type of creative, not to use our imagination. We've been, like as kids, we're told to use our imagination. Mom doesn't have enough money for all the toys that you want, for all the games that you want. Go play make believe.
Yep.
And now as an adult, you can play make believe with D&D, and you can use your imagination and just get lost in a world with some friends, and you really do start to develop, especially if you're playing with a character over and over again, you develop a sense of kinship with that character. Not only is it your creation, but it basically gains a life of its own through you.
Especially. Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, Cicero.
No, man. I'll just ramble. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say.
Well, I was gonna say.
Oh no, go ahead, Trey. You first.
You already answered the question, but for all the people that are wondering, why do these things matter when you're talking about a game that doesn't even have people in it? It's like elves and it's fantasy, so why does racial representation or who a person is sort of behind the character even matter when you're talking about the realm of fantasy? And that was a question I was going to ask for people who say it's just fantasy, it's just fiction. What does race have to do with any of that? And Cicero, you gave a beautiful answer about the imagination. So you're answering the question I had in my head that I wanted us to answer, because I think a lot of people say that what does it matter if it's all make believe? There's dragons and elves, and it doesn't. Why do we the conversation often happens with these pastimes, especially these things that have been, D&D was created by two white dudes in Wisconsin, right? So like, they're out there, and they're going to create a world that makes sense to them. They're going to create their version of Conan the Barbarian, their power fantasy.
Right.
And their power fantasy means that everyone that looks like them is going to be strong and powerful and what have you. And everyone that looks like the other is going to be subservient to them, because it doesn't fit the narrative of the power fantasy to have somebody that looks like us be equal to them. Someone with pointy ears is on a more stable footing than someone that looks like us. We're always going to be below it because of the creators. But it's the same way in everything else. It's the same way in comic books. It's the same way in movies. And one of the girls from Grownish has been cast in the live action Little Mermaid as Ariel. And everybody's losing their fucking mind over a mermaid.
That was like Childish Gambino as Spider-Man, remember?
Yeah. Right. Well, now he can be Miles Morales. That's okay now because, after the outrage of there being a black Spider-Man, he's in another universe and Peter Parker still exists. And, now that it's okay, now Donald Glover can be the black Spider-Man, the Latinx Spider-Man. But all over the place. When Idris Elba played Heimdall in Thor, he's Black Heimdall. Oh my gosh, you're destroying my mythology. and even in games, there was a lot of pushback when my partner and I created Spawn on Me. And we went straight for saying, look, we're going to talk about blackness and we're going to talk about how things are inequitable within this pastime that we love. And the constant refrain was, I don't want the politics in my game. And the thing is, what they're really saying is they don't want politics that they don't like in the games, because the politics are in the game. The politics are in every bit of media we consume.
Well, and it's the same thing in the LGBTQ community.
Absolutely.
Where it's like, you know what? It's politics for you, but it's my identity.
Right.
Every day, it's politics for me.
100%. And that's, and that's the thing is that for so long, white men especially have been the default that it winds up changing. It changes so much that everyone thinks that white people are the default. So when you're telling a story and you say, I was walking and I ran into this guy and I and I said the things, and the person in your brain that you're picturing is some white guy automatically, even me, so my partner, I'm in an interracial relationship. My partner hired a woman for her one of her positions, and she was talking to her one day on speakerphone as we're working from home. And this woman started right before the pandemic started, and I heard the woman speaking, and I was like, "Oh, she's black." And at no point did my partner say she hired a black woman. And it wasn't until I heard this woman's voice that I discovered that this woman happened to be black. And you can't imagine the level of pride and love that I had for my partner, because, here was an opportunity for her to pat herself on the back. And because, and she didn't even think about it. Like, it didn't even enter her equation that was something that she could be lauded over. Is, I took this opportunity to hire this person. And I'm like, oh yeah. And she was just like, yeah, well, I'm just going to hire the person that I like. And it just so happened to be that she was black. So, I mean, we've got to do the work to get rid of the default being white.
Oh my goodness, we could definitely go on for such a long time for this.
Hey, we're still on the air?
Actually, I just checked. We are, yes.
Yeah, no, we're still rolling. We're still rolling.
For those who have stuck with us, almost 15 minutes over, thank you so much. Honored is just the word for it. We want to continue these conversations, and we hope you're going to continue along with us. So on that note, I think we will officially close things out. Congratulations again to Edith Powell, and we hope that we'll see you on Monday nights for the role players. And the next time that we have this panel, remember to follow the hashtag, the role players 4 with the number 4 DEI. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.